Donald Trump's return to the White House and his tariffs have had a seismic impact on global markets. Trump's own personal brand is growing, from cryptocurrencies to merchandise and real estate, but his policies are also creating reputational risks for other American companies. Long before Trump, many U.S. brands were able to capitalize on the cool factor of being American. Take a look at these pictures from Moscow back in 1990. Huge queues outside the first McDonald's to open after the fall of the Soviet Union. International movements to boycott U.S. products have spread around the world since Trump first took office. A survey here in Germany last year found almost two-thirds of respondents intended to avoid buying U.S. products in response to Trump's policies. Just 24% said that they would definitely not avoid U.S. products. But that's not necessarily showing up in spending habits. This survey shows only a slight drop in U.S. brand spending in May of last year compared to the year before. Well, for more on this, now I want to go to the senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, Elisabeth Braw. She has written about the impact of Donald Trump's presidency on U.S. products for the Financial Times. Elisabeth, it's good to have you back on the program. What price, if any, are American brands paying for Donald Trump's policies?
What we can see is figures like the ones you just showed, that consumers around the world, in Europe, but in other countries as well, most especially in Canada, are saying we are not interested in buying U.S. products anymore, and more specifically, we don't want to buy U.S. products anymore. That is a terrible reputational price to pay for U.S. companies who have for so long benefited from exactly the fact that they are American and the sort of coolness factors that comes with being an American brand.
Yeah, let's turn the clock back for a moment here, Elisabeth. I mean, what has made American brands cool, and why is that at stake now? I mean, what was it about American brands that everybody couldn't get enough of?
It was the sense of freedom, which is why I think so many people queued up for when that first McDonald's restaurant opened in Moscow, back when the Soviet Union still existed in its dying days. But also, if we look at, for example, Coke and Pepsi, which both opened in Poland or started being sold in Poland, produced and sold in Poland back in the 70s. It was a huge thing, not because Poles particularly liked the taste of Coke necessarily, but because of what it conveyed. Freedom, most of all, the coolness of the American lifestyle. And that's what has continued in lots of countries all over the world. And that's why this is such a really a remarkable development, that consumers around the world are saying, no, we may still like Coke, for example, but we just don't want to support brands from the United States.
And, you know, I'm reminded of a time back in the 1990s, former President Bill Clinton was asked about spreading democracy around the world after the Cold War had ended. And he said, all you have to do is give countries Britney Spears and Coca-Cola, and then the rest will be automatic. We know it's not that simple. And I'm wondering, do they really link political policies to brands such as Coca-Cola and Levi's? I mean, do they make that connection?
They do, but the challenge is that as a result of globalization, it's hard for consumers to know which brands are owned by U.S. companies. So, for example, a local brand in Germany may have been acquired by a U.S. conglomerate. That's what has been taking place for 3 decades. So, but consumers are so incredibly clever. Now there are apps, including a new Danish app called Without USA, or non-USA in English, that helps you. These apps help you to discern whether the brand you're thinking of buying is ultimately owned by a U.S. company. This is how invested many consumers are. And this is why that matters so much. It's not really ultimately about whether they buy the product or not. It's that this sense that is spreading around the world that buying American is no longer interesting or attractive.
We know that supply chains these days, I mean, the world is still globalized. Supply chains often require input from multiple countries. With that in mind, I'm wondering how much would steering clear of U.S. products actually hurt U.S. businesses?
Not very much, I don't think. What we have seen is Tesla, which is indisputably an American brand, suffering to an extreme amount in foreign markets in the past year. And that is a result a direct result of Elon Musk being incredibly unpopular in other countries. But with other products, it's much harder to establish that link, and I don't think they'll suffer enormously as a result of this. But what they will suffer is reputational damage, because if your brand is no longer cool, you will struggle to grow it, and it's likely to ultimately decline. And that is also something that lasts for much longer than a temporary dip in sales. And so, for example, not to single any brand out, but if we look at at Coca-Cola with ice, well, what do you think of these days when you hear ice? You don't think of the ice cubes that you put in your Coke, and that is the challenge for American companies.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I know that the past few times that I've flown to the United States, the flights have not been booked out completely. Travel to the U.S., we know it dropped 6% last year. That's according to the World Travel and Tourism Council. So, Elisabeth, what does that tell us about Brand USA?
It is such a tragic state for American companies, not just consumer brands, but as you say, also for tourism, for airlines. And I've noticed the same thing myself flying to the United States. The flights are not as full as they used to be. And we should remember that Western airlines, opened many more U.S. Routes or expanded their flights to the U.S. after it became much harder to fly east to Asia because Russia closed its airspace. So they thought, this is the future, we'll fly more to the U.S. Well, now people don't want to fly to the U.S. And that will have an effect, is already having an effect on the local economy in popular tourist destinations in the U.S.
You know, many businesses, they are not shying away from Donald Trump this go around. I mean, we've seen people such as Tim Cook, the CEO of Apple, Mark Zuckerberg, CEO of Meta. You know, they've been whining and dining with President Trump. What do you think consumers, what do they make of that, other than maybe some people, you know, saying it's not a good look?
That's what they're saying. And it is the reality today that the American tech giants, they are almost impossible to steer clear of, even if you wanted to. But we've seen, for example, the Estonian government is, as we speak, testing a new system that is free of the US tech giants, not because it's trying to make a statement, but because it's saying what might happen if they decide no longer to provide software updates for whatever reason. So this is how dramatic the shift away from the globalized economy is, that even the government of Estonia, which is so open, so transatlantically minded, is saying we should think about alternatives to US provided software.
Elisabeth, before we go, let me ask you, is this an opportunity maybe for American brands to distance themselves from the policies of President Trump? Do you actually think that they could benefit by saying this is not what we support?
I don't think they would dare to do that. But what I do think will happen is that European brands will experience surprising or perhaps unsurprising popularity. European consumers, Canadian consumers in other major markets will say, well, what are the local brands that I can buy instead? And that's what you're already seeing on lots of Facebook groups. People are asking, what local brand from my country can I buy instead of this American brand I've been buying?
Elisabeth Braw, as always, Elisabeth, good to have you on. Good to get your insights tonight on American brands perhaps losing their cool factor. Thank you.
Thank you.